My name is Franklin Dorsey, and I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for years. My own son looked me dead in the eye one Friday night and said, "You eat but don't help." Those 7 words hit me harder than anything life had ever thrown my way. And the crazy part, that wasn't even close to the worst part of the night. We were sitting in his kitchen. Not just any kitchen, a kitchen with marble countertops that probably cost more than my first house. Crystal glasses catching the light like diamonds. Imported silverware that looked like it belonged in a museum. His wife Nora was scrolling through her phone somewhere in the background. His colleagues from work were standing around sipping wine like they owned the place. And me? I was just a man trying to enjoy dinner with his son. I'd paid for that entire house. $6.8 million. Not to brag, but I wrote that check myself. I'd worked my whole life, from the time I was 17 years old, to build something real. To build enough that my son would never have to struggle the way I did. I thought that house would bring us closer. I thought it would show him how much I loved him. But standing in that kitchen, watching him laugh with his colleagues about how his old man didn't understand the pressure of running a business, I realized something was broken. Something between us had shattered when I wasn't looking, and I wasn't sure it could ever be fixed. Hi viewers, kindly tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. Warm welcome to the family. Enjoy the story. When Theo, one of Evan's younger colleagues, joked about how lucky Evan was to have family support, I felt it coming. I could sense it the way you can sense a storm before it hits. My fork was halfway to my mouth. The whole table was quiet for just a second. And then Evan laughed. That laugh. The one that used to be innocent when he was a kid, but now it was different. Harder. Meaner. Support, he said, looking right at me. You mean people who just eat and don't help? The table erupted. Everyone laughed. Everyone except Caroline, my wife. Everyone except me. And you know what I did? I smiled. I actually smiled. Because in that moment, I saw him, really saw him, for the first time in years. I saw a man who'd forgotten where he came from. A man who'd become so wrapped up in his success and his status and his fancy wife from old money that he'd completely lost sight of the foundation everything was built on. I finished my meal. I didn't say a word. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't storm out or cry or make a scene. I just quietly put my fork down, looked at my son like I was studying him, and smiled that knowing smile. The kind of smile that says, you have no idea what's coming tomorrow. Because here's the thing, I'd given Evan control of the business. I'd given him a title and a salary and a company car. But there was one thing I'd never given him. One thing that was still entirely in my name, sitting right there on paper, locked away in documents he probably didn't even know existed. That beautiful $6.8 million house? Still in my name. That marble kitchen. Still in my name. Every square inch of glass and pride and status? Still in my name. And the next morning, a certified letter arrived at his office. By the time he opened it, his whole world was going to shift on its axis. His colleagues would hear him gasp. His hands would shake. And everything, absolutely everything, would change. So here's my question for you. If you were in my shoes, if your own child had just humiliated you in front of a room full of strangers and called you worthless, what would you have done? Would you have stayed calm? Would you have planned your next move? Or would you have exploded right there at that dinner table? Drop your answer in the comments below. I want to hear from you. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida, in a one-room shack that barely kept the rain out. My father was a dock worker, the kind of man who'd leave before sunrise and come home with his back bent from 16 hours of loading and unloading cargo. My mother was a seamstress. She could take fabric that cost 40 cents a yard and turn it into something a rich woman would wear to church. She taught me early that you don't need much when you've got pride and you've got purpose. We weren't poor in the way people talk about poverty now. We weren't hungry or uncared for. But we were poor in every other way that matters. My shoes had holes. My clothes had patches. For school, I wore hand-me-downs from kids whose families actually had money. I remember the feeling of shame, yeah, but I also remember something else. I remember my mother's hands. Calloused and cut from needles and thread, but always gentle. Always. And my father's laugh, rough and tired, but real. That kind of laugh that comes from a man who's lived through hard times and found joy anyway. By 17, I was done with school. Not because I was stupid, I wasn't. I just knew that every day in that classroom was a day I wasn't working, wasn't earning, wasn't building something. So I found work at a car garage on the edge of town. It was called Murphy's Auto. The owner was a man named Tom Murphy, and he took one look at me and saw something. Not a charity case. Not a poor kid. He saw hunger. He saw someone willing to learn. I worked nights and weekends for 5 years. Changed oil. Fixed transmissions. Learned every bolt and screw and wire in those cars until I could do it in the dark with my eyes closed. Tom paid me cheap, but he paid me honest. And more than that, he taught me that there's dignity in work. Any work. You could be fixing a car for a man who owned half the city, and that job mattered just as much as everything else you'd ever do. Because you did it right. You did it with respect. You did it because your name was on it. That's when I decided. I was going to start my own business. Dorsey Heavy Mechanics. Started it with nothing but a tin roof, a wrench set I'd saved up for, and the knowledge Tom had given me. I worked 18-hour days for the first 3 years. Didn't take a vacation. Didn't go out. Didn't have any life outside of that garage except for one thing. I met Caroline at a church fundraiser in 1983. She was serving lemonade at a table, and when she smiled at me, something shifted. She had this quiet way about her, like she could see right through all the rough edges and the oil stains and the exhaustion, and she saw a man trying to build something real. We married 2 years later, and our son Evan was born the year after that. He was a beautiful baby, smart from day one. When he was 5, he was already doing math problems. When he was 10, he was reading books that kids 3 grades above him were struggling with. Caroline used to laugh and say, "Franklin, this boy is going to do something we never dreamed of." And she was right. He did do something we never dreamed of. We just never imagined he'd do it by forgetting where he came from. 4 years, I built Dorsey Heavy Mechanics into something real. Not flashy, but solid. Dependable. The kind of company where people knew if you needed something fixed right, we'd fix it right. We grew from just me to 10 employees. Then 20. Then 50. We moved from that tin roof to a real building. Then bigger buildings. We started servicing commercial trucks. Then logistics companies. Then we became the company that logistics companies called when they needed their fleet maintained. Evan watched all of it. He saw his father come home covered in grease and sweat, and he also saw his father come home proud. Satisfied. Like a man who'd built something with his own 2 hands. And for a while, he respected that. For a while, he looked at me like I was a hero. But success, like I said, has a way of changing people. And my boy was about to prove that in ways I never could have imagined. Evan graduated from college with a degree in finance, and I was the proudest man alive. I went to that graduation ceremony and sat in the bleachers with Caroline, watching my son walk across that stage in his cap and gown, and I cried. I actually cried. This was the kid who'd come from nothing, just like me. This was the boy who was going to have choices I never had. Options. Real opportunity. He came to work for me right after graduation. He was hungry, smart, and he had ideas. Big ideas. He'd look at my business, Dorsey Heavy Mechanics, and he'd see something I couldn't see. He'd see growth potential, investor potential, corporate potential. And honestly, I liked that about him. I liked that he looked at what I'd built and said, "Dad, this could be so much bigger." So I did what every father wants to do. I made room for my son to shine. I gave him a title, a salary that reflected his education and his ideas. Even a company car, a nice one, not something fancy, but nice. And then I stepped back. Evan brought in investors. Real investors with real money. They rebranded everything. The company that I'd spent 30 years building under the name Dorsey Heavy Mechanics suddenly became Dorsey & Company. Logistics. They updated the website. They made everything look sleek and corporate and modern. And it worked. Within 2 years, we were handling twice the work we'd ever handled before. I should have been thrilled. Part of me was. But another part of me started noticing things. Little things at first. Evan stopped calling me Dad. Started calling me Franklin. When he'd introduce me to people, he'd say, "This is Franklin. He founded the company," like I was a relic of a different era. Like I was the dinosaur that had to evolve into him or get left behind. He stopped asking how I was doing. Stopped calling on weekends. When I'd show up at the office to visit, he'd introduce me around and then excuse himself to take a call or handle something urgent. He was too busy being the new version of himself to waste time on the old version. And then he met Nora. I remember the day he brought her to our house. She came with blonde hair and a quiet smile and a dress that probably cost more than some people make in a year. She was polite, never rude. But there was something cold about her. Something that looked at me and saw a problem that needed solving. Caroline felt it too. I could tell by the way she gripped my hand under the dinner table that night. Nora came from old money. The kind of money that doesn't make noise. It just exists in the background like oxygen, so normal and natural that you don't even think about it. Her father owned real estate in 5 states. Her mother had been on the board of 3 charities. They went to the country club. They knew the governor's family. They were the kind of people who'd always assumed they'd be important. And Evan wanted nothing more than to be like them. He started dressing different. Expensive casual. The kind of clothes that cost more than dress clothes because they're supposed to look like they didn't cost anything. He started using words he never used before: investors, portfolio, market positioning. He started referring to my early days with the business like they were an embarrassing phase he'd outgrown. Back when my dad was doing it the old way, he'd say, like old way meant stupid way. I could see Caroline's heart breaking. She'd sit on the couch in our house, the house that felt smaller every year, and she'd just watch her son become a stranger. And I'd watch my wife watch our son, and I'd feel this helplessness that I'd never felt before. Not even when I was poor and struggling. Because I could fix that. I could work 18-hour days and build something. But I couldn't make my son see what was happening to him. About a year into his relationship with Nora, Evan came to me with a request. He wanted to move. He said he needed something bigger. Something that reflected his position now. Something that showed investors he was serious. He said the word image about 4 times in one conversation. Image. Like that was the most important thing in the world. I didn't argue. I didn't even hesitate, really. I just sat down at my desk, pulled out my checkbook, and wrote a check for $6.8 million for a house I'd never even see. And that check was going to change everything. The house was in an exclusive development just outside the city, the kind of place where the gates are higher than most people's houses and the driveways are longer than some city blocks. 12,000 square feet. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows that looked out over a view that went on for miles. Marble everywhere. Italian tile. A kitchen that looked like something from a magazine. A master bedroom with a bathroom bigger than my garage. I remember the day Evan showed it to Caroline and me. He walked through it like he was showing off a trophy, not a home. "What do you think?" he kept asking. "Pretty amazing, right?" And it was. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost impossible. A way that made it hard to believe people actually lived there and not just visited to stand in awe. But Caroline and I, we didn't feel at home there. We felt like visitors. Like tourists in our own son's life. The first dinner invitation came about 3 months after he moved in. They wanted us over on a Friday night. Just something casual, Evan had said. But when we showed up and Nora opened the door, there was nothing casual about it. She'd hired staff. Real staff. People in uniforms serving food on china plates with these tiny portions that looked like art more than dinner. The table was a showpiece. Crystal glasses. Imported silverware. I remember Evan mentioning it was Danish or Norwegian or something like that. A centerpiece so big you couldn't actually see across the table to talk to the person sitting opposite you. It was the kind of dinner that wasn't about eating or talking or connecting. It was about showing off. I sat there, and I could feel Caroline squeezing my hand. She was nervous. She knew what was happening. We both did. Evan was disappearing. The boy we raised, the man we loved, was slowly being replaced by this thing that looked like him but wasn't. And there was nothing we could do to stop it. Evan barely looked at us. He was too busy talking to these colleagues of his. Young guys in expensive suits, all of them laughing and drinking wine like they'd been training for it. Nora floated around like a ghost, not quite present, always on the edge of things, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. I tried. God, I tried. I asked Evan how business was going. "Fine, Franklin," he said, not even looking up from his plate. "We're doing what we can to keep things afloat. Not that you'd understand the pressure." There it was. That tone. That dismissal. Like I was ancient history. Like the fact that I'd built the foundation he was standing on meant absolutely nothing. Caroline kicked me under the table. Her signal to stay calm. Don't react. Don't make a scene. Just get through the night. But then one of his colleagues, a guy named Theo, made a joke. He said Evan was lucky to have family support. It was meant to be complimentary. It was supposed to be a nice thing. And Evan laughed. That laugh again. The mean one. "Support," he said, and now he was looking right at me. "You mean people who just eat and don't help?" The table went quiet. I could feel every pair of eyes on me. I could feel Caroline's hand go rigid under the table. I could feel the moment before everything changed, the way you can feel a shift in the air before a storm hits. And you know what I did? I smiled. Not because it was funny. Not because it didn't hurt like hell. I smiled because I finally understood what needed to happen. I finally saw what my son had become, and I understood that sometimes love means letting people experience the consequences of their choices. He kept going, talking about how his old man didn't understand the modern business world, how I was outdated, how our early success was mostly luck anyway, and his success was about intelligence and strategy and real business acumen. He sat there and deconstructed everything I'd given him, and he did it in front of people who mattered to him, people he wanted to impress. Nora even gave him a warning look. This tiny shift in her expression that said, maybe that's enough. But Evan was on a roll now. He was impressing the important people. He was showing them he wasn't tied to his past. He was showing them he'd transcended his simple, working-class origins. The rest of the dinner was a blur. I finished my meal. Caroline and I stayed until it was polite to leave. We said our goodbyes. Evan didn't walk us to the door. On the drive home, Caroline cried. She didn't say anything, but her shoulders shook and she stared out the window and she cried. And I sat there, hands on the steering wheel, and I felt something solidify inside me. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity. Like I finally understood what was coming next. Like I finally knew what I needed to do. And I also knew that sometimes the best lessons in life aren't taught with words. Sometimes they're delivered in silence, through actions that force people to reckon with who they've become. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Caroline, listening to her breathe, feeling her warmth, and thinking about a conversation I'd had with my lawyer years ago. We were setting up the business structure. We were making sure everything was properly documented. And I'd asked him a simple question. What happens to the company if something happens to me? What happens to my assets? He'd walked me through all of it. The deed to the house. The business ownership. The insurance policies. All the papers that make a life official. And I'd signed things and filed things and basically built a legal fortress around everything I'd worked for. But here's the thing. I'd done that before Evan even existed. Before Caroline. Before I knew what it meant to be a father. So when I'd bought that $6.8 million house and handed the keys to Evan, it never occurred to me to put it in his name. It was a gift. A beautiful, extravagant gift. But it was never meant to be a surrender of control. It was never meant to be a blank check for him to transform into whatever he wanted to become while erasing me from the equation. I got out of bed around 3 in the morning. Went to my small office, the one with the faded wallpaper and the desk I'd built myself 30 years ago, and I pulled out the documents. All of them. Property deeds. Business ownership papers. Bank statements. Insurance policies. Everything. And there it was. Clear as day. The house was in my name. The business was in my name. Technically, it was a limited partnership, and Evan had some ownership stake, but I still held controlling interest. Everything that mattered was still anchored to Franklin Dorsey. I sat there in the dark, holding those papers, and I made a decision. Not an angry decision. Not a vengeful decision. A practical one. A clear one. My son had forgotten who'd given him these things. He'd forgotten that gratitude was worth more than gold. He'd forgotten that respect for your parents isn't old-fashioned, it's fundamental. So I was going to remind him. Not through shouting. Not through a confrontation. But through consequences. Through the language every generation has to learn eventually. The language of accountability. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer's home number. He answered on the third ring, groggy and annoyed. Franklin, it's 3 in the morning. I told him what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to serve Evan with an eviction notice. I told him that the house was no longer a gift. It was now collateral for a lesson that needed to be learned. He tried to talk me out of it. Franklin, you'll regret this. You'll damage your relationship with your son beyond repair. But I was calm. I was clear. My relationship with my son is already damaged, I told him. At least this way, maybe he'll finally understand why that matters. By noon the next day, I had the paperwork drawn up. Legal and binding. A certified eviction notice that gave Evan 30 days to vacate the property. No explanations. No emotional appeals. Just a letter that said the landlord, that was me, had decided to reclaim his property. I had it delivered to his office as a certified letter. I wanted the moment to be public. I wanted him to open it in front of his colleagues. I wanted him to feel that moment of exposure, that moment when the world you've carefully constructed reveals its fragility. And when he opened that envelope, his entire perfect life shifted on its axis. The person I'd been so desperate to impress had finally shown me who he really was, and I'd responded in the only way that made sense. I'd shown him what his own pride looked like when it didn't have my foundation holding it up anymore. I'd given him the gift of a consequence, and I'd wrapped it up in a certified letter and sent it to his office. Now the question is, what happens next? How does a son respond when his father finally stops enabling his transformation and demands something he hasn't offered in years? Respect. Stay with me because that answer is coming. And trust me, it's going to change everything. The phone call came at 7 in the morning. That's when I knew he'd opened the letter. Evan's voice on the other end was shaking, barely controlled. "Dad, we need to talk. Now." He never called me Dad anymore. Just Franklin. So hearing that word, Dad, told me everything I needed to know about what he was feeling in that moment. I told him to come to my house. Not his office. Not some neutral place. My house. The small one with the faded wallpaper. The one that was small enough to feel crowded when he walked through the door, small enough that he'd remember where all this actually started. He arrived 30 minutes later. His car pulled up to the curb, and he got out like someone moving through water. Like the air was too thick to push through. He was dressed in one of his expensive casual outfits, but it looked disheveled now. Like he'd thrown it on without thinking. His hair wasn't perfect. His eyes were red. When he came through the door, I was sitting in my office. Caroline had made herself scarce. She had an instinct for these moments, for when two men needed to be alone. Evan stood in the doorway, and for a second, I saw him clearly. Not the version of himself he'd been constructing. Not the polished, successful guy. Just a man. Scared. Confused. Starting to understand that the world his father had built wasn't actually his to tear down. "You can't do this," he said. His voice was tight. Controlled, but barely. "You just can't. That's my home. My marriage. My life is in that house." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move. I just looked at him the way he'd looked at me across that dinner table, like I was studying a stranger. "Sit down," I said. He sat. "You know what your mother told me after that dinner?" I asked. He didn't answer. "She said she felt like she was losing her son. Not to success. Not to business. To forgetting. To deciding that gratitude is for people too weak to move forward." Evan opened his mouth. I held up my hand. "Let me finish. That house was a gift. A beautiful, expensive gift that I gave to my son because I loved him. Because I wanted him to have everything I didn't have. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing it as a gift. You started seeing it as proof that you'd transcended me. That you'd become better than the man who made it possible." His hands were shaking. "I have a mortgage, Dad. We have investments tied to that property. Our life is structured around." "There is no mortgage," I said quietly. Evan's face went pale. "I paid cash. The deed is in my name. There is no bank breathing down your neck. There's just a father who finally decided his son needed to remember what respect feels like." He didn't have much to say after that. He tried arguing. He tried reasoning. He tried explaining how this would look to his colleagues, his wife, his investors. But every argument just proved my point. Everything in his world was about appearance. About image. About the impression he was making on people who didn't actually care about him the way his family did. After about 20 minutes, he left. No apology. No moment of understanding. Just a man realizing he had less control over his life than he thought. And maybe that was the point. Maybe that was the first real lesson he needed to learn. Caroline came out of the bedroom after he left. She didn't say anything. She just wrapped her arms around me and held tight. We stood there in that small house, in that office with the faded wallpaper, and we held each other. Because doing the right thing doesn't always feel good in the moment. Sometimes it feels like breaking something you wanted to save. But sometimes, that's exactly what love requires. Over the next few weeks, the news spread. Evan's colleagues heard about it. His wife heard about it. The people in his world who mattered to him suddenly saw him differently. Not as the successful logistics guy. As a man who'd been humbled by his father. And the shame of that, the exposure of it, that was its own kind of eviction. An eviction from the false world he'd built. So what happens when pride finally breaks? When a man realizes that everything he thought made him successful was actually built on something he'd discarded? Does he double down? Does he fight harder? Or does something shift inside him? Stay tuned for the next chapter, because the answer might surprise you. Subscribe now and turn on your notifications so you don't miss what comes next. This story takes a turn that changes everything. And if you've ever felt unappreciated by someone you helped build, share your story in the comments. Let's inspire each other. 2 weeks after the eviction notice, Evan came back. That's all I'm going to say about the timeline. 2 weeks of silence, 2 weeks of him probably trying to figure out his options, calling lawyers, trying to find some legal angle I'd missed. 2 weeks of the reality sinking in that you can't lawyer your way out of a truth you've been running from. He showed up on a Saturday afternoon, no warning. Just pulled up to the house like he was driving towards something he'd been dreading. I was out front, watering the garden. Simple work. The kind of work that keeps your hands busy and your mind clear. He got out of his car and just stood there for a moment, and I could see it all over his face. The weight of it. The exhaustion of pretending. I need the copies of all the documents, he said. Straight to business. No apologies, just logistics. My lawyer says we can challenge this. Says there might be grounds to argue that the house was a gift with conditions, and I can contest. Evan, I said, still watering. What are you trying to do? What do you think? Get back what's mine. It was never yours, I said. That's the part you still don't understand. It was something I gave you. And I can take back something I gave you. That's not a legal issue. That's just the truth. He went quiet. I turned off the hose and looked at him, really looked at him. He'd lost weight. His eyes had that hollow look people get when they haven't slept properly. The perfect version of Evan was cracking. The real one was showing through. Nora left me, he said suddenly. Just blurted it out like he'd been holding it in and couldn't contain it anymore. She said I was a fraud. She said that without the house, without the status, I wasn't the man she married. So she left. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say anything about Nora being a woman who only saw symbols, not people. I just put the hose down and sat on the porch step. After a moment, Evan sat next to me. I've been living in a rental apartment for a week, he said. 1,200 square feet. Bare walls. No furniture except what the landlord left. And you know what? I have furniture in storage from before I had money. From before I cared about image. And I couldn't bring myself to get it because that felt like admitting I'd failed. We sat there in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need filling. The kind that does the work all by itself. I was awful to you, wasn't I? He asked. Yeah, I said. You were. How are you sitting here like this? Like you're not angry. I took a breath. Anger would imply I didn't expect it. But I did. I expected my son to forget himself for a while. I expected success to change him. What I didn't expect was that he'd do it so completely that I wouldn't recognize him. That was the hard part. Not the disrespect. The disappearance. Evan started crying. Real tears. Not the controlled kind. The kind that come from somewhere deep where you've been lying to yourself for so long you can't remember what the truth feels like. And I let him cry. Because sometimes that's what love looks like. It looks like giving someone space to fall apart. After he got himself together, he asked if we could talk about the business. About what came next. I told him we could talk about anything he wanted. But first, he needed to understand something fundamental. Success wasn't a destination where he got to rewrite his story. Success was a responsibility. Especially when the people behind you had sacrificed to give you the platform. He listened. He actually listened. And for the first time in years, I felt like my son was in the room with me instead of some stranger wearing his face. The sun was starting to go down when he got ready to leave. He stood at his car and he asked, "Are you going to keep the house? Keep it as collateral or something?" I smiled. "I'm going to give you a chance to earn it back," I said. "But you'll understand it differently next time. You'll live in it differently. And you'll remember every single day who gave it to you and why they trusted you with it." He nodded. And then he asked something that told me the real work was just beginning. "Can I come back? To help with the business? Not as the guy running everything. Just as someone who wants to learn again." That question, that simple, humble question, that's when I knew my son was finally waking up. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications because what happens next is the moment that changes everything. This is where the story goes from teaching a lesson to rebuilding something real. And that's the story this family needed. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to teach someone a hard lesson to save the relationship? Share it with us. I told Evan to start at the bottom. Not the way I had to, because the world didn't give me a choice, but because he needed to. He needed to feel the work. Needed to understand that every dollar the company made came from the sweat of people who showed up every day and did their jobs right. So he got a shop coat with his name on it and he showed up at 6 in the morning with the mechanics. He changed oil. He cleaned parts. He did the work that was invisible and unglamorous and absolutely essential. And he did it without complaint, without trying to impress anyone, without looking for recognition. The guys noticed. You can't work alongside someone for weeks without understanding who they actually are. At first, they were suspicious. The boss's son, dressed down, playing at being a regular mechanic. But Evan wasn't playing. He was genuinely learning. Asking questions. Listening to the guys who'd been doing this work for years. Respecting their knowledge the way he should have respected mine. It took about 3 weeks before I noticed he'd stopped checking his phone during lunch breaks. Another month before he came home to his apartment and just sat in that empty space, exhausted and content in a way I'd never seen him before. He was building something real again. Not status. Not image. Just the solid satisfaction of work done right. During this time, something shifted between us two. I'd show up at the shop sometimes, just to watch. Not to judge. Just to observe. One day, I was in the office when Evan came in covered in grease, and he said something that made me understand he was finally getting it. He said, "I spent years trying to get away from this. From manual work. From people who work with their hands. And I was running from the best part of myself." That's when I knew the real lesson was sinking in. Caroline was happy in a way I hadn't seen her in years. She'd have Evan over for dinner, and it was different. There was laughter that felt real. Conversation that wasn't about proving anything. Our son was becoming human again instead of a monument to ambition. After about 4 months, I called Evan into my office. This was my real office, at the facility, not the small one at home. I had some documents on my desk. Legal documents. He saw them and his jaw tightened. He probably thought I was preparing something else, some other consequence. "I spent a lot of time thinking about your question," I said. The one about coming back to the business. About being part of something again instead of running from it. Okay, he said carefully. I've decided, I continued, that I want you to be my partner. Real partner. We'll restructure the company. You'll own 40%. I'll own 40%. And we'll bring in someone external for the remaining 20 as a check on both of us. Evan's face went through about 5 different emotions in as many seconds. After everything. After what I said. After I made Mom cry. Because of all that, I said. Because you're learning that success and family aren't opposites. They're only powerful when they're connected. You came back. You asked for a second chance. You're actually taking it seriously. That means something. He came around the desk and hugged me. Not the awkward, stiff hug he'd been giving me for years. A real one. The kind your body does when your heart finally catches up with your head. There's one condition, I said when we broke apart. What? You call me Dad. Only Dad. The Franklin thing ends now. He smiled, and it was genuine. Not the smile he'd learned from his wife and her country club friends. Just the smile of a man finally feeling relief. Deal. Over the next few months, we rebuilt the company differently. Evan brought his modern ideas, but now they were filtered through respect for what we already had. The strong foundation didn't change. But the future got brighter because we were building it together instead of him trying to build something on top of something he decided was too old to matter. The house came later. About 8 months into the process, I signed the deed over to him. He didn't ask for it. I offered it. And he took it, but differently than before. He understood now that a house is just walls and glass. A home is something built on respect and gratitude and the understanding that the people who helped you get there should always have a place in it. Nora never came back. That was fine. She'd served her purpose. She'd been the catalyst that forced us to confront what was actually important. But there's a new woman in Evan's life now. Someone he met at church, someone kind, someone who values his character more than his portfolio. And when he introduced her to us, the first thing she said after meeting me was, "Your son talks about you like you hung the moon." That's when I knew we'd actually fixed something. Not just patched it. Actually rebuilt it. Don't miss what happens next. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join thousands of people who believe that family can be repaired, that pride can be healed, and that a father's love never really stops trying. Drop a comment and tell us about a time you had to fight for someone you love. Tell us about a time you got a second chance and actually took it. Your story matters. Your experience can inspire someone else who's struggling right now. A 1.5 years had passed since that dinner where my son looked me in the eye and said I didn't help. A 1.5 years of learning and working and slowly rebuilding what broken pride had almost destroyed. The business was thriving, stronger than ever, actually, because now it had the best of both worlds. The solid, ethical foundation I'd built, and the modern strategy Evan brought to the table. We were sitting in a meeting with our accountant when she smiled and said something that made me realize how far we'd actually come. "You two have a partnership that makes sense," she said. "It's rare. Most family businesses either never evolve, or they evolve right out of respecting the foundation. You managed to do both." After she left, Evan looked at me and said, "I owe you an apology that's been a long time coming." "You've apologized already," I said. "Not like this. Not all of it." He pulled out a piece of paper. It was a letter. Handwritten. "Long, I wrote this months ago, but I wasn't ready to give it to you. I'm ready now." I took it. The envelope was heavy, substantial. I could tell he'd rewritten it multiple times. "You don't have to." "I want to," he said. "I want you to know exactly what I was feeling. Exactly what changed. Exactly where I went wrong. Not so you'll forgive me again, because you've already done that. But so you know that I actually understand what I did." I opened the letter and read it slowly. He'd written about the shame he felt when the eviction notice arrived. About the moment he realized every person who'd mattered to him in that world had only mattered because of what he could give them. About the night he cried in that empty apartment and realized he'd spent years running away from the man who'd built the only thing that actually meant anything. About understanding that his father's love had never actually stopped, but his recognition of that love had disappeared so completely that he'd forgotten what gratitude even felt like. By the time I finished reading, I was crying. Not sad crying. Release crying. The kind of crying you do when something that's been broken finally comes back together. "Thank you for writing this," I said. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he replied. "I would have understood if you had. Most people would have. Most people would have let me figure it out on my own and stayed angry." "I was angry," I said. "But I was also your father. And your father's job isn't just to love you when you're doing things right. It's to love you through the things you're doing wrong. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." He nodded, and I could see him really absorbing that. Understanding it in a way that went deeper than just accepting the words. "I want you to do something for me," I said. "Someday when you have kids and they disappoint you, when they forget themselves, when they hurt you, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that their character is built as much by the consequences they face as by the love that underlies those consequences. You're not going to do them any favors by letting them become people who humiliate their fathers and forget their roots." "I know," he said. "That's the thing that scares me now. Knowing how easy it is to lose yourself. How quick it happens. How good it feels at the time." We sat for a while longer, just being in the space of what we'd rebuilt. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments where old patterns tried to emerge. But we'd learned something that matters, that broken things can be repaired if both people are willing to do the work. The house is no longer just a showpiece. Evan's renovated parts of it, but he's left it fundamentally unchanged. He says it serves as a reminder. Every time he walks through that marble kitchen, every time he looks at those glass walls, he remembers what it cost his father to give it to him and what it cost him to almost lose it. My wife jokes that I should write a book about this. About relationships and second chances and the power of silence sometimes being louder than words. But I don't think it's a book story. I think it's a story that every family needs to know. Because in a world that's increasingly disconnected, where kids get distracted by success and status, where parents are too tired to hold the line, this is a reminder that relationship is always worth fighting for. Subscribe now and turn on notifications because there's one more chapter to this story, and it's the part where the lesson becomes universal. This is where what happened to my family becomes something that can help yours. Don't miss it. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell us what you've learned from your own second chances. Let's build a community of people who believe that family matters more than anything else. If I'm being honest, I never expected my story to become something that mattered to anyone but me. I told it because I needed to make sense of it. Because I needed to understand what happened and why it happened and what it meant to be a father who had to teach his son about gratitude through loss. But somehow, the story spread. Someone heard it and told someone else. Someone posted about it online. And suddenly, I was getting messages. From fathers who'd watched their sons forget them. From sons who'd realized too late what they'd taken for granted. From families torn apart by pride and money, and the kind of disconnection that happens so slowly you don't even realize you're drifting until you're completely lost. The thing they all asked me was the same thing. How did you know? How did you know that the answer wasn't more love, more gifts, more sacrifice? How did you know that sometimes the answer is boundaries? The truth is, I didn't know. I had to figure it out the hard way. I had to sit with my wife after that horrible dinner and realize that love sometimes looks like saying no. That sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the consequence of their own choices. Because the only thing worse than losing your son is watching him lose himself, and being powerless to stop it because you've made yourself completely expendable. What I learned, what my son learned, is that real love requires respect. Not just the parent respecting the child, but the child respecting the parent. That reciprocal respect is what builds something that lasts. It's what prevents success from becoming a wall between you. It's what keeps a family connected even when life is pulling you in different directions. The house is still standing. The business is still thriving. My marriage is deeper now than it's ever been because Caroline and I went through something hard together and came out on the other side understanding each other better. And my son is building a life that's real. Not performative. Not designed for anyone else's approval. Just real. He's talking about having kids. When he does, I plan on telling them this story. I plan on making sure they understand that success without gratitude is just a really elaborate way of being alone. That status without character is a house with no foundation. That money can buy you a lot of things, but it can't buy you the kind of peace you get when you honor the people who helped you build your life. This story isn't really about revenge. It's not about an old man teaching his arrogant son a lesson. It's about understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do for the people you love is to let them experience their own choices. It's about knowing that unconditional love doesn't mean unconditional enabling. It's about being willing to break something temporarily so you can rebuild it stronger. For everyone watching who feels like they're losing someone to success, to status, to the kind of disconnection that happens in families everywhere in this country, I want you to know something. There's still time. They might be angry. They might resist. But if you hold the line, if you're clear about what respect means, if you're willing to do something hard in the name of love, there's still a chance. There's always a chance. The best lessons aren't taught in anger. They're delivered in silence. And sometimes, they come in the form of an eviction notice that's actually a wake-up call. Sometimes, they come dressed up as loss so your son can finally understand what it means to have everything. Evan calls me every morning now. Not because he has to. Because he wants to. We talk about the business. We talk about his life. We talk about Caroline and what she's doing. We talk like a father and son are supposed to talk. With presence and respect, and the understanding that this relationship is more valuable than any financial success could ever be. If you've made it this far, if this story has reached you, I want you to do something for me. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on those notifications. Because there are more stories coming. Stories about families who faced the impossible and chose to fight for each other anyway. Stories about people who woke up in time. Stories about the power of second chances. And please, drop your story in the comments. Tell us about your struggle. Tell us about the time someone held a boundary with you and you hated them for it until you understood why it mattered. Tell us about the family member you've reconciled with. Tell us about the second chance you were given and what you did with it. Because your story matters. Your experience can be the thing that saves someone else's relationship. Your voice can be the permission someone needed to have this conversation with their own child. Your willingness to be vulnerable can inspire others to be vulnerable too. This is what family is supposed to be. Not perfect, not pain-free, but real, connected, built on the foundation of mutual respect and the understanding that gratitude is worth more than gold. Evan learned that. I learned that. And now, I hope you will too. Thank you for being here. Thank you for caring about this story. And thank you for remembering that the people you love are always worth fighting for.